thank you to everyone at the Providence Community Library for helping us coordinate this event. It's great working with all of the libraries and making sure that all of the community has access to these great conversations. Again, my name is Justin Silverman, New England First Amendment Coalition. We have a really important and I think insightful conversation in store for everyone. I'm going to get to introductions in a moment, but first I want to tell you a little bit about my organization, the New England First Amendment Coalition. We're the region's leading advocate for the First Amendment and the public's right to open government. So we work in a number of areas, including free speech, making sure that journalists have the tools that they need in order to engage in better investigative journalism. We also work with government transparency issues and making sure that all of you, the public, have access to public records and open meetings. We also provide a number of resources to everyone, whether you're just interested in the First Amendment or whether you're teaching the First Amendment or any related issues, media literacy, as well as getting journalists into classrooms to talk about their profession. We provide a number of tools and resources for you. So I encourage everyone to go to our website, nefac.org, and take a look at the work we do and how you can get involved. As I mentioned, we have a great discussion in store for everyone. Before I get to introductions, I do want to just let everyone know that we will have a Q&A session at the end. We'll have about at least 15, 20 minutes to take everyone's questions. But I want everyone to feel comfortable posing questions and comments in the chat box as well throughout this conversation. I'll be monitoring that chat box, and as Joseph mentioned, he will too. And we'll take your questions and comments as they're most appropriate to where we are in the conversation, and we'll make sure that they're asked, and all of our experts this evening will have an opportunity to answer them. So quickly, some brief introductions for all of our panelists, beginning with Gregory V Sullivan, who's an attorney, a member of the NEFAC board. He also serves as general counsel for the union leader, and he teaches First Amendment law at Suffolk University School of Law, as well as the Nakias Loeb School of Communications in New Hampshire. Greg, raise your hand for everybody. Thanks for being here, Greg. Greg's going to start off the program giving everybody a primer about the First Amendment and its protections of hate speech, what it protects, what it doesn't, where the legal lines are, and give everybody a good understanding as to where hate speech fits within our law, within the Constitution. From there, we're going to go to MICHAELLE LARRACUENTE, who is the Dean of Student Culture of Achievement at First Providence Mayoral Academy in Providence. She's a Providence native as well, raised in and grew up in Providence. And Alana Rosenberg, who is from the Youth Pride. She's Executive Director of Youth Pride. Both MICHAELLE and Alana are going to give us some broader perspective about the consequences of hate speech, giving us some insight into the very communities that are the target of hate speech and the burden that hate speech puts on us all. They have a lot of perspective and insight as to how hate speech affects those that are targeted by it, whether it's because of their race or ethnicity, their sexuality, whatever the case may be. We'll get a better understanding as to just how hate speech is affecting those in our communities. And then Stephen Brown from the ACLU of Rhode Island. He's the executive director there, has been for, I believe, over 30 years now. Stephen's going to wrap up the discussion by giving us some perspective from his interesting position at the ACLU, an organization that spends its time defending First Amendment rights, including the right of people to engage in hate speech and say really nasty, vile things, but at the same time, being responsible for protecting people's civil liberties and the interests of the very people that are the target of that speech. So, very interesting position that that Stephen is and his colleagues are in at the ACLU, and he'll give us some more insight there. So to begin our program, and again, as we go along, please feel free to make comments and questions, use that chat box. But let's begin with Greg. If you could please give us an overview of hate speech as it relates to the First Amendment. Where does it fall within our constitutional rights to free speech? Where are those lines when it comes to our ability to engage in hateful, offensive speech?
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, everybody, for being here, panelists and participants who I can't see, but I hope you can see me and hear me well. So the First Amendment, I'll start off by saying, says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. It's a short version relative to free speech. But it's not just Congress that the First Amendment applies to. In 1927, the Supreme Court of the United States said that the First Amendment applies to all governmental actors, federal, state, and local. And a big misconception is that it applies to private actors, and it does not. If the government's not involved, the First Amendment is not involved. And despite what the First Amendment says, as we all know, free speech is not unlimited or absolute. People are familiar with you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. So I call my class that I teach at Suffolk Law School First Amendment Media Law, but then sometimes I call it the Five Freedoms, because the First Amendment guarantees freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. I call it the Five Freedoms. And then as we get into it, I change the name of my class to Where Do You Draw the Line? Because there are, as the Supreme Court has said, classes and categories of speech that get no First Amendment protection. And they include obscenity, defamatory speech, libel and slander, true threats, bribery, perjury, solicitation to murder, false advertising, and you haven't heard me say hate speech. I'm here to say that hate speech is protected by the First Amendment. Pure and simple. To quote the Supreme Court in a 2017 case, they said, the proudest boast of our free speech jurisprudence is that we protect the freedom to express the thought that we hate. That's when we need the First Amendment the most. And some of you may be familiar with the Nazis or the American Socialist Party that was represented by the ACLU in Illinois, when the Nazis wanted to march with their SWAT stickers and uniforms in Skokie, Illinois, which at the time, I guess 50 years ago now, was predominantly a Jewish community with many survivors of the Holocaust living there, and the Nazis were allowed to march. It used to be the Supreme Court had what's called a clear and present danger test relative to laws and speakers and the government's ability to shut speakers off. In 1969, the Supreme Court gave us the law we have today. It's called a modern incitement test. It comes from the case of Brandenburg versus Ohio. Brandenburg was a Ku Klux Klan spokesperson, and the speech that he gave was truly hate speech. Things like, let's send all the Jews back to Israel, let's send all the niggers, let's bury the niggers, is what he said, let's send them back to Africa, on and on. Just the most vile, disgusting speech we can imagine, protected by the First Amendment. The modern incitement test says that government cannot shut us up, even if we're advocating the use of force and violence or law violation, unless such advocacy is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action. So that's the test that we have today, and why I call it, where do you draw the line? And one thing to remember, although I quote the Supreme Court, every case turns on its own set of facts. So when are we crossing the line, when our speech becomes, oh, one thing I didn't mention, or maybe I did, was true threats. Threats to commit a crime is a crime. But when is a threat what the courts call a true threat? If I'm on my internet, my computer, and I'm speaking to someone in California, and I say, geez, I'm thinking I'd like to kill you. Well, that threat is not likely to produce imminent harm. I can say things right now, like, don't you think we all should perhaps overthrow the government by force and violence, the way society is today? Can't we start over? I don't think I can be arrested and prosecuted for saying those things because my advocacy is not eloquent enough to incite you to immediate lawless action. And that's actually what the test is. One thing I want to say, in 1989, a fellow named Johnson was burning the American flag in Texas. It actually was outside the Republican National Convention in 1984. And as the delegates were coming out, he was burning the American flag. And at that time, that was a crime both in Texas and federally. He was prosecuted, and 5 years later, his case came to the Supreme Court of the United States. And they said, if there is a bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment, it is that the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds the idea itself offensive or disagreeable. I shorthand that and say the government can't shut us up just because people don't like what we're saying. I'll shut up in a minute because we've got a lot of interesting people here with a lot of thoughts. But I will mention the case of Snyder V Phelps, which you all may be familiar with. It's the practitioners of the Westboro Baptist Church. And their slogans include God hates Jews, God hates fags, on and on along those lines, which is bad enough. But they like to espouse those thoughts at the burial services of soldiers who are killed in either Iraq or Afghanistan these days. And they go to the cemeteries and they hold up their signs with these slogans. They believe that the soldiers are being killed because our society tolerates homosexuality. And they have the right to espouse those views, as detestable as we may think. Now, one thing I will say, the government can impose what's called time, place, and manner restrictions. So the courts have said that these protesters at the burial services of soldiers must stay, they have a buffer zone, 100 feet away, 1,000 feet away, whatever a particular court may say, just to protect the tranquility and privacy of the grieving families of these deceased soldiers. So again, the question for all of us every day is, where do you draw the line? And that's probably enough out of me for the moment. Thank you all.
Greg, a follow-up question for you before we move on, because I think while it's really helpful for everyone to understand where those lines are, or at least where those lines are questionable, and as useful as it is to understand that the First Amendment protects hate speech, can you explain to us why it does? I think it's just as useful, if not helpful, for everyone to understand why that legal protection exists under the First Amendment, unless it's incitement, unless it's a true threat or one of the exceptions to First Amendment protection. Why should that type of speech that's so difficult to hear? I mean, it's painful hearing some of these words. Why is that protected? Why should we be subjected to that kind of language?
The why goes back a couple of centuries to some fellows in England, John Stuart Mill and John Milton, who created this concept of the marketplace of ideas. And our society, and I'll quote the Supreme Court, the ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas, that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. We protect hate speech because we're also protecting our own speech, our own truth, to overcome the hateful speech. Because where do you draw the line is a dangerous concept when it's the government who's telling us what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in the marketplace of ideas. So we're really protecting our own speech, truthful speech, when we protect hateful speech. That at least is the concept that our democracy is built upon. The truth and the fight against falsehood will prevail.
So if I understand you correctly, it's not so much about protecting this particular language as it is keeping government at bay, making sure government isn't drawing the line, and protecting speech, all speech, from unreasonable government restrictions. Is that a accurate assessment?
And that word unreasonable is reasonableness. I tell my class underlies all law. So, is it reasonable to tolerate hate speech? The courts and our Constitution, our First Amendment say yes. And there are plenty of people, probably people on this panel, who disagree with that concept. But I, for one, believe that in the long run, free speech promotes truth and democracy, and that good speech will always win over hate speech. The way to fight hate speech is with more intelligent speech.
So even if behind the First Amendment, the framers' intent, there were some very noble principles and causes that led to how the First Amendment was written and the protections it provides. MICHAELLE, if we could go to you, every single day you're working with students that are young students that are very impressionable, that are often the target of this type of speech. I mean, what are you seeing at Mayoral Academy every day as far as how our youth are dealing with this type of language and how they're coping with some of the vile things that are often said to them?
Yeah, thank you, Justin. Hi, everybody. Again, my name is MICHAELLE LARRACUENTE. I'm the Dean of Student Culture or Motivation and Investment at Providence Middle School, Achievement First in Providence. And I'm also the co-chair of Youth in Action's Board of Directors. So it's really interesting thinking about hate speech in the sense of some of these more iconic or historical elements. And yet we have to think about hate speech also as everyday hurt speech. And so in the context of the students that we serve, both at Youth in Action and at Providence Middle School, right now our middle school serves 416 students from grades 5 through 8. And every day they are battling not only this middle school time frame where their bodies are changing, their relationships are changing, their identities are shifting and changing, but they're also trying to figure out their place in the world. And so we've almost normalized teasing and other low-tiered fruit in terms of what this hurt speech phenomenon or spectrum is. And so we have students of color and marginalized populations that are the students that we serve in our metropolitan area of Providence, and have to consider all of the different cultures at bay as well. When we think about a lot of these laws that were created, they weren't created for all the people who would be impacted by them. They were created with a particular demographic in mind because positionality matters. And so we do have people who might not have had a seat at the table now being impacted by all of these choices that have been in place for a long time. When working with our students, we're constantly considering not only their physical safety, but their emotional and spiritual safety. And so we have our traditional elements such as our character ed program, but students are battling their home lives, how they're right now grappling with COVID in their kind of environments, and how are they also thriving, or for lack of a better word, surviving as a scholar who's now a virtual learner in this very new concept that even as adults, we can't really understand because we're not living it with them. We're watching them live through it, but we can't truly understand where they are. And so where does this hurt speech fall into these elements? Well, every day they're trying to navigate, well, I want to be popular. I want to be cool. I want to be affirmed. I want to be liked. I don't want to push the dial. And so they might internalize or accept the, oh, you're stupid, or that's dumb, or your parents don't speak English, or, and then the list goes on and on. And what we also have with these populations are different stigmas around mental illness and around support and around depression and anxiety. And for myself, being a first generation American, I remember very clearly being told, oh, we don't have that in our country, or you'll be fine, or toughen up, or suck it up, or other notions around this isn't a serious problem, or you need to figure out how to cope with it. And we don't affirm young people always for their opinions. We think that they don't know enough, that they haven't lived, so they're not really sure. And we're not always listening. We might be hearing young people, but truly do we understand what are their needs and what are their developing skills in place? And so within Achievement First, we're thinking a lot about how do we make sure students feel comfortable that they can advocate for themselves at any time that they need. And why this is so important is even within the 2019 statistics, we have 1 out of every 5 students report being bullied. And within those students, 41% of them report that they believe they're going to be bullied again. And we have to see this as an urgent pandemic in itself. Young people are not always safe. And if they don't feel comfortable going to their guardians or parents or other key stakeholders, they go to each other. And we see how problematic that can be. And so they're teaching each other, they're trying to survive on their own. And many of our young people just develop different low tiers of depression or anxiety. Some of them go into self-harm. And so although we've talked about how hate speech can lead to attacks on other groups, what about the hurt speech that leads to attack on self? When students are no longer confident, when they feel like they're at their wits' end, they don't know what other choice to make, and then we have a growing rate of youth and young adult suicide. Hurt speech, hate speech has such a spectrum, and young people are trying to navigate and battle with that every day. We don't always prioritize it, especially in this time and age. We're thinking about test scores. We're thinking about, are they going to be the new force that's going to keep our economy running? And then keep in mind, like the media, we have a $1 trillion industry that pushes self-improvement, lighter skin, better hair. And for a lot of people of color, that's telling them, you are not correct. You are not good enough. You must fix yourself. You must align with popular demand. And what does that do over time, creating that sense of trauma for young people, for even adults? And depending on the family structure that we're engaging with, we find young parents or older parents who are passing down those same traumatized mindsets and experiences to their kids. And that's a lot.
So MICHAELLE, what do you do? What are some of the tools, if you will, that you provide your students in order to get beyond some of the language that they're hearing and to make sure that they're dealing with it or managing it in positive, healthy ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think early on, affirming students is the most important thing. When they recognize tension or feeling in the body, they have to do something about it. They can't just brush it off. And then when you identify that pit in the stomach, or the feeling where your skin's red, or where you feel like you're blue, or you feel like you're gray, then how to help them make sense of the feeling, that's the physiological reaction, and then, or the palm sweating, and then what is the appropriate coping strategy? Like, what are the ways that kids unpack and unload that heavy weight on their shoulders? Every time they just bottle things up, it will lead to the volcanic reaction later versus supporting every different symptomatic thing along the way.
No, Ilana, have you had similar experiences at Youth Pride? What are you seeing with the young adults that you're working with every day? Similar difficulty managing the language and the speech that they're hearing outside of the school? What are some of the experiences that they're having?
Yes. And the one thing I just caught right there is that you said outside of the school, and in truth, a lot of this is happening within the school, right? This is not like, that is their work, that is their environment, that is their life outside of home. It's school. And so, I love MICHAELLE's distinction of hurt speech. I was thinking, hateful speech, right? Like that things don't raise to the level of hate speech, hate crime, to have an impact, right? That we see so much internalized message all over the place, right? The young folks that YPI works with are between the ages of 6 and 24, and we see this at every age level in every kind of way. We, as humans, internalize messages immediately, right? And if the message is about you, and it's repeated enough, whether it is direct and loud and angry and something that's the community would say, yeah, that's hate speech, or whether it is just said so often and hurtful in a way that it becomes a really powerful unexamined idea, right? Like just a belief that you have about yourself or you have about whoever it's being said about, right? So Youth Pride, YPI, we provide support, advocacy, and education to LGBTQ youth and their allies, and work to end homophobia and transphobia across the state of Rhode Island. And we do that through a variety of services in a drop-in center in Providence, and also through professional development and advocacy and outreach and policy work, you know, on the individual level and on the institutional level across the state. So what we do, you know, the main needs that we have in our center over the years are counseling and case management, basic needs pantry access, right? We run a food and clothing pantry. And we know that those impacts and those percentages that MICHAELLE mentioned are greater as identities start to compound, right? And one of the beautiful things about the LGBT community is that we are members of every other community that's out there. So you're not an LGBT person without having intersectional identities. That's just, I mean, truthfully, like nobody is, right? We all have intersectional identities, but it's more clear to some folks than others. And so I think, yes, we experience all of those things, and it's really important to think about the intention and the impact of words and actions, right? I think that kind of the way that YPI has tackled this over the years is to try to change the mindset of the communities and the institutions that these youth are a part of, right? So what we're looking to do is build a community that is supportive, that is going to address that hateful speech when it happens, and teach folks why hate, like what the impact is, right? And help people understand it as it's happening between youth. Otherwise, it does just become perpetuated, believed, institutionalized, reproduced generation after generation after generation.
MICHAELLE, actually, if I could go back to you, because in a previous conversation, you used the phrase legacy of trauma. Could you explain that a little bit more? What do you mean by that?
Sure, yeah, and I really appreciate things that Alana was mentioning. I'm just thinking a lot about the legacy of trauma. For me, really kind of digs into what someone has internalized within their life course, they pass down. And so when a woman of color feels that she will never be equal or seen in the public eye as valuable as a white woman, then she teaches her daughter to believe the same. Then that young girl decides, when she interacts with her desired preferences, whether it's male or female, what have you, she teaches them how to treat her. And then internalize the self-fulfilling prophecy around, well, I was treated poorly because I don't deserve to be treated well. So I do things that will validate them treating me such ways, because I already know this is what I deserve. This is all I will ever deserve. And we don't validate every identity in this country. We teach brown children every day that their life is not equal to that of a white person when they get to watch a police officer kneel on a Black man's neck. And positionality matters, because what I loved that Gregory said earlier is like, the way that you stop hate speech is with good speech. But the good speech of a person of color is not always received or put in the same light or respected or prioritized by the good speech of someone white. Sometimes the messages get across that a person of color is saying when a white person says it. And at the end of the day, I'd rather leverage all of my allies to get the work done. But people of color often struggle with seeing themselves as equal parts of the table at the conversation. Will my voice matter as much as someone else's? And because history will teach us that no, it doesn't, they start to believe and internalize, well, then why would I fight now? What indication would reassure me that this is worth my effort and that something will be different? I also just wanted to add really quickly something that I heard Elena also talking about is like, how do we change the dial? We have to teach young people it is okay to hold each other accountable. And to name, again, this piece around impact, like when a person, especially in cultural groups, like roasting or teasing or playing around in that way is common, affirmed, and normalized. Oh, you're stupid, you're this, you're that, your mother this. And yet when it actually starts to hurt, there's a thing happening internally. Do I react physically and I cry? Do I pretend it doesn't matter and I walk away? Do I now go into flight mode? And yet, what if we taught children to say, hey, I think actually that went too far. Like, you know how hard my mother works? Like, it actually wasn't okay for you to say that about her or about me or about my culture. But we're not teaching children to stand up for themselves in a healthy way. Developmentally, that what they want to do is flee or they want to fight. And we say that boys will be boys and it's okay for girls to cry. And so how are we changing the stigma and affirming kids to really stand up for themselves in a healthy way?
It's a great point. Thanks for bringing that up. Stephen, I'm going to go to you in just a moment. And Greg, I know you have a question, but I'm going to pose one to you first, and then I'll have you give your comment. Because I think there's this real misconception sometime around the First Amendment, in that while it protects the type of speech that we're discussing here, I think many people assume that it's endorsing it somehow, as if through that protection, the First Amendment is saying it's okay to engage in this type of language, when it's not about that at all, right? It's about, again, keeping the government at bay and ultimately letting us, the people, figure out the best way to communicate among ourselves. And based on the experiences of MICHAELLE and Ilana, it sounds like in many cases we're doing a poor job of figuring that out, and we could do better to provide some support to all of us and some better guidance on how we can better communicate with each other. Before you get to your comment, Greg, could you just comment on that, the idea of the First Amendment not endorsing the speech that it's protecting, but in fact being neutral and letting us figure out the best way to provide discourse among each other?
It's neutral. Oh, am I muted?
Nope, just unmuted you. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. No, I wouldn't even say it's neutral. The Supreme Court repeatedly talks about it's the speech that we hate that gets protected. And they indeed often will say, as vile and disgusting as this speech is, it's protected. So I wouldn't say neutral. The reason I was putting up my hand, I want to say that, first of all, things are getting better. I say that as perhaps the elder statesman here. And when I think of these two young ladies talking, I think to myself, when I was a kid, if I ever said that I thought Barack Obama was going to become president of the United States or Kamala Harris was going to be the vice president of the United States, I mean, I'm so happy with that progress, not to diminish the systemic racism that we're all facing, but to me, there's real hope. And I want to go back to schools for a minute, because schools are different than society in general. Students and teachers have First Amendment rights, but not as strongly as others in society. There are limits. And in fact, in the last 10 years, in both New Hampshire and Massachusetts, the two states that I practice law in, laws have been passed protecting pupil safety and violence protection. One of them talks about bullying, which is a single incident or a pattern of incidents involving written, verbal, or electronic communication, or a physical act or gesture, or any combination thereof directed at another pupil, which interferes with the pupil's educational opportunities, which interferes with causes emotional distress in a pupil, creates a hostile educational environment. I mean, these laws are coming along. Stephen will know better than I how Rhode Island's doing, and the women on the panel may know too. But what I'm saying is society is recognizing the problems, I believe, and taking affirmative steps to remedy it. Doesn't change the First Amendment protection on hate speech, but schools do have different rules, and speech that disrupts the educational environment will be punished and prohibited.
Stephen, let's stay on the topic of the First Amendment here. One of the cases that Greg mentioned earlier was Skokie. This was an ACLU case, one that I've always found incredibly interesting, given that it was a Jewish attorney that was representing the free speech rights, the First Amendment rights of a group of Nazis who wanted to parade through a Jewish community. Tell us about your experience being at the ACLU, having to defend these First Amendment rights and some very vile, hateful speech, but at the same time, working in other ways to protect the rights of minority communities and the civil liberties of all.
You're right, Justin. The ACLU is in a unique role. As you can tell from the Skokie example, the ACLU is a very strong believer in free speech. We've taken a lot of hits for having this very strong view about the importance of free speech, for the views we hate, as Gregory has said. But we also believe just as strongly in equal rights, equal protection of the law that's also guaranteed by the Constitution. Day in and day out, we're filing lawsuits on behalf of people who are the victims of race discrimination, sex discrimination, protecting the rights of immigrants, and so forth. I think the way I like to sometimes view the importance of free speech, defending the free speech rights of Nazis, is really from a self-interest point of view, from those who really cannot stand, and rightly so, the views of those individuals, because ultimately the decision of who gets to speak when we're talking about the First Amendment is the government. Do we want to give the government the choice, the discretion to decide who can speak and who can't? I think all of us on this panel might agree on what is hate speech and what we don't like, but there are other people out there who would have different views. And if we give government the power to make the decision of who can speak, of what constitutes hate speech, I think we will find ourselves on the losing end sometimes, and it will be too late to do something about it. The fact of the matter is that every progressive movement in this country has relied on freedom of speech to get its message across. I mean, you can go back a century. I mean, Margaret Sanger was arrested for handing out information about contraception. That's no longer a crime because the First Amendment protects it. LGBT rights, the civil rights movement have all really been protected by having a First Amendment that doesn't give government the power to decide who can speak, who can't, what is hateful, what is not. The one case that I always like to give when I'm talking about hate speech and this idea about being principled is there's a 1949 US Supreme Court decision called Terminiello versus Chicago. And the case concerned this defrocked Catholic priest who was a fascist, an anti-Semite. He booked an auditorium in Chicago to give a very fiery speech that was fascistic and anti-Semitic in its comments. And a large crowd gathered outside the auditorium, a crowd that was opposed to this person and what he was saying. And it got a little rough outside, and some violent incidents occurred. And the response of the police was to arrest the speaker in the auditorium on the grounds that his talk essentially created this breach of peace, even though it was the people who opposed him who'd engaged in the violent conduct. And this case went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. You can't have what we call a heckler's veto, allowing people who disagree with what you say to prevent you, who is being peaceful, from being able to speak. And the reason I like to cite that case and the importance of that Supreme Court decision is that that was one of the key decisions that courts then used violence. Again, not violence from him, but from people who disagree with the message. And relying on this case on behalf of this anti-Semite, the Supreme Court was able, and other courts were able to protect the rights of the civil rights community to march peacefully in places where they were not welcome at all. So I think that really sends an important lesson about why the indivisibility of the First Amendment is really so crucial in our society, because otherwise you're at the whim and discretion of government officials, and what a President Obama thinks is hate speech is going to be very different from what a President Trump thinks is hate speech.
So Ilana, having heard all of that, clearly there's a long game here involved when it comes to the First Amendment, when it comes to keeping government in check. But is any of that convincing to the children and young adults that you work with when they're hearing really hurtful language? Are they concerned at all about the what I think could appear as these abstract principles that are involved with the First Amendment, or are they just thinking, hey, I'm getting beat up verbally here, and I don't like it?
I mean, it's a wide range, right? Youth in general are a spectrum, and there are developmental stages, right? The ability to kind of see perspective is something that we gain over time and through our lifetimes, and also dependent on the trauma and the experiences that we're going through, right? Like some people grow up really quickly in some ways and are also stuck in where they were when they experienced that trauma in other ways, right? So how people identify these or internalize that is different person to person. Just ask me your question again, because I lost it in that response.
My fear and something that I work with every day is explaining to sometimes young students like yours these very, I think, important and valuable principles that the First Amendment, that supports the First Amendment, and trying to have others understand why these certain protections are in play. But part of me, sees these very individuals dealing every day with hurtful and hateful speech. And I wonder, does that type of education, is that convincing to them? Or are they just so focused in on their own experiences that it's really hard to show that there's a greater good here with these First Amendment protections that might be difficult to see day to day?
I think there's continuity for the LGBT community in some way because of the LGBT movement, right? And being able to say, in fact, quite recently, we lost a community member who was still very active at YPI as a supporter and a board member and a volunteer, who was on the lawsuit to sue the city of Providence to have our first gay pride parade, right? So that it's not so far removed from them that they don't understand the reason that they want freedom to express who they are and be how they are and be themselves. And so that is freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And so I think they understand the value of the First Amendment protecting that, right? I appreciate Gregory's sort of schools have policy in place and protections in place, and those things work when it's happening in front of a teacher who knows how to respond to it and knows how to reach out to the ACLU or to YPI when it doesn't get addressed, and it's not happening between two students in the locker room or the bathroom, or you know what I mean? And so it's not as the impact and the effect of hateful speech is broader than just where those protections are. And you're right, there are things in place and things are better in some ways, but also, in the time that I have been around YPI, in the 10 years that I've been in this organization off and on, I've seen, even just the difference in the administration, which you mentioned, Stephen, like there's the impact on our young folks is visible. In the change and how the suicidality rates, their discomfort, their fear of where they can be and where they feel safe, right, is definitely has increased in those ways, in those places.
Is there a common sense that this type of language should be outlawed and people should be prevented from speaking this way, or is the mindset we've just got to do better amongst ourselves to provide support where it's needed, and to make sure that while we might have a legal right to say these words, we shouldn't. It's not a productive, healthy way to live.
Yeah, I think to Alana's point, there's a lot of pieces around education. And, youth are at the mercy of adults, right? They don't have rights. They don't have privileges in the world in the way that adults can just kind of do whatever. And so they heavily rely, whether you're a 5-year-old who's learning to tie their shoe or you're an 8th grader who doesn't understand how to apply for high school, like you go to these people because you trust they're put in these structures, these institutions that have taught you in the media and in your life that they are seeking your best interests. You could be a very talented teacher, but you might have a fixed mindset about race, about religion, because again, you come with your own noble and personal story. And not always do we carry noble stories about other groups. Again, how we were raised, how we were conditioned. And so even though we are the United States, we are very divided in how we have progressed in our country. And I say that because when I want to travel to a particular part of the United States, I'm not choosing the South. And that's not an accident. I will go to California, or I'm going to the most metropolitan city of a particular state, not to the suburbs. Even in the state of Rhode Island, I feel uncomfortable going to particular diners in Cumberland or Smithfield or what have you. But I know I can walk around Providence. There's a certain privileges in this way, and even in the Northeast, that are not extended to me in Mississippi. And so I think about, what are we doing in terms of due diligence to make sure that our teachers, our educators, our service workers, our social workers, et cetera, are really being developed properly to ensure that they are safe for kids? They might keep kids physically safe, but are we really teaching students to understand what it means to have an impact on someone, to be a part of their story, to influence how they see each other and how they shape each other's worlds? And then do teachers really understand how students soak up their entire world? And so every little thing, overt or covert, implicit or explicit, students see. They see everything and they want to comment. And when they don't, because of fear of consequence, they talk amongst themselves, or they start developing their own self-worth and concept, like I mentioned before. And so I think in general, again, developmentally, they may see connections to the outside world, but mostly they rely on us to help them understand the world. And so it really is the responsibility of administrators and organizations to think about, well, what is the vision we want to project and what do we want kids to walk away with? Because that's truly what's going to set them on the course to not even have to question, should I say this? But they walk around thinking, oh, what an opportunity to learn about a culture. What an opportunity to celebrate, affirm, and engage with this population versus fear, retribution, or exclusion. We teach those concepts. They are not just innate in us.
That's great. I would even add that, those are great principles to live by, not just within schools, but just everyday life for all of us to operate that way. Stephen, I'm sorry, I think you were trying to get a word in before I went to MICHAELLE.
No, I just wanted to emphasize that laws can only go so far in helping, and education, as you've heard, I think that really is the key. How children themselves are educated, ensuring that the right values are inculcated in them by their teachers. That ultimately, in the long run, is how this type of hate will be reduced. Without that, no law is going to take care of that.
Stephen, if we could stay with you for just a moment, there was a interesting question posed by one of the attendees about the marketplace of ideas. And Greg, please feel free to jump in as well, or anyone really. But this concept of the marketplace of ideas and how we have a First Amendment that's keeping government at bay, drawing very strict lines as far as where the government can restrict speech and where it can't, so it can provide the public all of the ideas, the good ones, the bad ones, the hateful ones, and allow us, the people, to sort through them all and to make sure that the good ones rise to the top. Does the marketplace of ideas work? This attendee, I think, has a really valid question here. Are we putting too much faith in the marketplace of ideas? Is there any evidence that it's actually working in the way that it was intended?
I'll start. I think it is. Well, first, I think it's important to keep in mind there are lots of theories behind why the First Amendment is important. The marketplace of ideas, which Gregory's talked about, is one of them, and I think it's valid, but there are others. There's the whole, just a notion of individual self-worth that the First Amendment recognizes, the self-interest idea that I talked about, making sure the government operates on a level playing field. So there's no one particular reason, I think, to say we need a First Amendment. There are lots of reasons. In terms of the marketplace of ideas, again, you can't have a fair debate if one of the debaters is gagged. And there certainly has been progress when it comes to where we are than where we were 100 years ago, 200 years ago. It's an ongoing process, but I think it's right to say that only by allowing people to express their views freely can you get to some version, the truth. I mean, people can have different versions of the truth, but I'm looking at justice. It will lead you more to justice than gagging people will. And, I mentioned Margaret Sanger. I mean, there were, in the First World War, people were put in prison simply for opposing the war. So we have moved greatly, and we've moved greatly because we have had this First Amendment that allows everybody to speak their mind.
That's great. I like how you put it in terms of justice. So often when we talk about the marketplace of ideas, we're always talking about getting to the truth. But I like the notion that it can also bring us, and is more likely to bring us to justice as well. This particular question, when it was posed, it had to do with truth. Greg, in your opinion, has the marketplace of ideas, this concept, has it brought us closer to the truth? I mean, we're in an age of misinformation, disinformation, of various people having fundamental disagreements over what the truth is. Where does the marketplace of ideas actually fall into all of this now?
100 years ago, look at 50.
Greg, sorry, if you could just repeat the last sentence. You were on mute, but you're good now.
Muted, huh? Stephen just said we've made progress looking back 100 years ago and looking back 50 years ago, and I was going to add looking back 1 year ago. The Black Lives Matter movement, for example. To me, that's been a huge presenter of the truth of where we were 200 years ago, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 5 years ago, last year with George Floyd. Where were we and where should we be? I'm all about the marketplace of ideas and the fact that our society, as bad as things are, is advancing. I was doing some research on hate speech and whether or not it should be outlawed. And if you look into it, I have a list of 38 countries, including England, Canada, Brazil, on, Belgium, all that have laws against hate speech. So if you think it's a good idea, you're not alone. I, however, am going to continue to rely on the beauty of the First Amendment. It was in 1942 that a fellow went to jail in Rochester, New Hampshire for calling a police officer a goddamn fascist and a racketeer. Fellow went to jail for 2 years. His case went to the Supreme Court of New Hampshire, and his conviction was affirmed, and it went to the Supreme Court of the United States, and his conviction was affirmed. It was a fellow named Chaplinsky. And the court at that time said there are well-defined and narrowly limited classes of speech which we can prevent and punish. I'm paraphrasing, and they talked about the lewd and obscene, the profane, the libelous, and they said the insulting or fighting words. And they say these utterances inflict injury and tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace. They are no essential part of any exposition of ideas and are of such slight social value as a step to the truth that any benefit that may be derived from them is clearly outweighed by the social interest in order and morality. Now, I don't like that case, Chaplinsky, where the poor fellow went to jail for 2 years, but there the government, the Supreme Court, is saying what we're supposed to be doing as a society is stepping towards the truth. Now, in that case, they advocated more for order and morality. And I say, well, whose morality was that? And why is order so important? I don't like that case, but I like the fact that they recognize we should be stepping towards the truth. And I think we are doing that. And I think we are doing that through the marketplace of ideas. And the marketplace of ideas is what led to a vote in November to change our government, which I'm all for. And to me, that's what democracy is all about, the ability to speak freely and the ability to have your speech heard by as many people as possible. And when it's truthful speech, I think the audience is more receptive. At least that's the hope of our Constitution.
And I think it would be nice, ideally, if we were all, had that objective and all going in that direction. But as another attendee mentioned, they posed a question about Section 230, which I'll explain in a moment. You look online, you go on social media, you don't see a lot of voices out there searching for the truth. You just see a lot of fighting, a lot of conflict, and a lot of trolls, really. So, Ilana, if I go back to you, the role that social media has, the statute, Section 230, by the way, it's a federal statute that, for those who aren't familiar with it, internet sites, social media platforms, in large part from the content that's published on them by third parties. With that kind of protection in place, with all this vile language on social media, do you have any guidance, or what kind of guidance do you give to the students that you work with, the young people that are so impressionable, that are going online? Do you have any suggestions for them on how to either combat or manage all of that negative discourse out there?
Yes. I mean, I think that what we're trying to do with them is help them be critical thinkers, right? And be critical consumers of the messaging that's coming at them and of their own sense of self, right? And so as we work on those things, hopefully they're able to let some of that messaging slide off their back more, and we teach them some skills about how you can address things in a more productive way, right? To give them outlets, right? And that's the other piece, is that we bring them together and give them an opportunity to support each other in that. And so, I think that's why we also do so much work offering professional development to whoever will listen to it. That I cannot ask my young people to be the ones to change the world completely, right? Like, they're the ones who are experiencing this and are subject to it. And so it's the rest of us who have to get together to make the change for them.
Michaëlle, how about with your students? Is there any general guidance that you provide them, or some approach that you take when it comes to online speech and the language that we see through social media often?
Yeah, we've done some work, and honestly not enough work, because this, again, technology in this way is so powerful and growing in a way that we have to always be really on the mark and up to date. But we've done various seminars for both students and for families around what are pro tips and best practices for how to engage with technology in a safe way, in a healthy way, and again, a supportive and community building way. And yet when we are approach or have access to information that is a red flag, how to engage, how to report something if something doesn't feel safe, how do you report that to a big person in your life, so that way you can get the support that you need. And again, there's never been a more important time for young people to have an ally and have someone they feel safe going to. That we cannot control how children get information anymore. And that is a scary thing to say, but unless a child doesn't have a phone, doesn't have a computer, and at this point, they wouldn't be able to learn without one, we cannot control what they get. And at different times in generations, we could say, you only can use the house phone, or you have no reason for a cell phone. I didn't get a cell phone until I was 17. And we have fourth graders with an iPhone 12. And so, I mean, it's just so different in that way. But we really have to be mindful, again, this education of adults is what we need to turn key to children. If they don't know what's going on, they don't know what they don't know, and we can't appropriately support young people. And what was it, Frederick Douglass, that said it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. But at this point, if we have never rectified, dismantled, and really have examined our choices and have the appropriate reparations, we're going to continue the same cycle, because children will never be strong because we haven't held ourselves accountable.
Another question posed here is, when we're dealing with hate speech, we're often putting a tremendous amount of burden on those communities of people that are targeted by the speech. Any suggestions on how to give members of those communities, in the words of this one attendee, a seat at the table to really have some influence over these discussions, the way that all of the concepts here that we're describing tonight are defined, and how we deal with them moving forward? Any suggestions as far as that's concerned?
It comes from the leaders of the community, to me, obviously, and that's it. Comes from the top down, whether it's the president of the United States or the president of the city council or the alderman. We elect people to represent all of us, including children, and those are the people that need to speak out against hatred and for justice. And that's why it's important we pick the right leaders and we all vote for those leaders. That's, again, how our democracy is designed. And congrats to all the teachers as well, and the student counselors and the deans of students, the administrators, because Stephen said it, MICHAELLE said it, Alana said it, it's all about educating the children. Those are the leaders of the future, and that's where our hope lies, is in the schools. And again, being my age, an elderly person, which I hate to admit, I have seen tremendous progress in our leaders, in our society, in our fight against hatred, all the way around. Not that there's not a long way to go.
And to that end, another really interesting question here. We discussed a lot tonight about the First Amendment itself as a legal protection, but we've also discussed too about the burden that those protections put on many in our community. So what I'd like to hear from all of you is if you have any suggestions or guidance on how we can spread that burden, if you will, if we can make it a little bit more equitable and support those communities for those situations when there is hate speech, or when really hateful things are being said about someone in public, and we're there to oversee it. What can we do if we don't have hate speech directed at us personally? Is there anything that we can personally do to combat it when we see it in public?
We're doing that right now, Justin. It's all about education.
MICHAELLE, as an educator, what do you think would be the most effective way to educate your students, or educate others outside of your school about how to combat hate speech and how to be a support for those communities that are the targets of that speech?
I think we need to hold leadership accountable. To Gregory's point around it is leaders, it is a top-down phenomenon. If you're in a place of work where it's almost that these things are non-existent, then we're complicit because we're not creating space. And we have no idea people's ideas or their positionalities on these issues. And what better place to come to a common understanding or shared definition than through really powerful and dynamic conversation. I think often we steer away from conversation because we are not prepared for conflict, but I find conflict to be very positive. It's the engagement of different positions, and we can't really see where each other is coming from if we don't give each other the opportunity to share the opinion. And so for adults, we need to be pushing and ensuring that no matter what place of work, there is space that is consistent and prioritized around unpacking our individual experiences and creating collective identities, the same way we have collective languages and within our different works. And then for our young people, it's also creating those dynamic spaces for them because they aren't too young to talk about these things or start developing their own opinion. Because even if we want to shelter them, the media will teach them. And if we don't control the narrative, they are not going to be set up for success.
I love that. I also think that when we shelter folks, especially young folks, that we're not really sheltering. We're just creating this sort of, danger around whatever we're talking about, or wrongness around whatever we're sheltering them from. Because what we're doing is saying, no, we're not going to talk about that. And it's not a, oh, that's not a problem. That's not a big deal. It creates some a reason to notice it, a reason to kind of internalize it, whatever it is, right? The only other thing that I would add to this is that I think that there is a place for self-education, right? So whoever you are and whatever you're the place that where you are in this, if you're listening to this panel thinking, I don't hear much hate speech around me or in my environment, like start listening for it, because it probably is there and you're not hearing it, right? So that's the first place, like catch it when it happens, hear it, question your beliefs and other people's, even if it's just internal and self-reflecting. And then I think the other thing is to like practice and lean into the discomfort. It is uncomfortable to call somebody out, to say, I think that might be offensive. That makes me uncomfortable. I don't like it when people say things like that around me. Why did you say that? What did you really mean by it, right? Like that is uncomfortable. So what we work on with our young people, we have a couple of tools and techniques. And if you want YPI to come do a panel for you or a training for you, we're happy to do that. But that there are a couple of techniques that, we say, here, go stand in front of the mirror and practice this. Because everybody can probably think of a moment where they were in a situation, whether it's hate speech or, something that was sexual or whatever, that made you uncomfortable, that you just didn't know like what to say. And then the moment's passed. And so if you have spent 5 minutes in a mirror saying, when you said that's so gay, that made me really uncomfortable, don't say that around me anymore. The next time you hear it, you can push yourself a little bit to just sit in that discomfort and say it. And so that's the other thing I would say is like practice, find a way to practice.
Justin, can I jump right back in? Because something that she's saying just really sparked my whole brain. But I think this other notion of, I don't really see this, or this is so foreign to me. Like, I really want to push people. Like, if you wanted to go to a place to eat and you've never heard of the restaurant or had no idea, you would Google it. You would take action. You would hold yourself accountable to figuring it out. And at this point, no one can say they have not heard of a racist act, of a sexist act, of a what have you act. And yet some of us are too comfortable not engaging in that world as if it is not a part of their reality. It is our reality, regardless if you were the victim or perpetrator. And so when we take this feigning ignorance mindset, we postpone our own growth and development. And then we perpetuate and are complicit in other people around us also not growing, because we were making a conscious choice at this point. When I have people that I care dearly for who say to me, oh, I'm not sure what to read so I can learn about. If you Google anti-racist, magic appears. No, normal things appear. And we also don't identify these red flags sometimes because it happens so often. We have normalized this trauma. And so a woman of color is always going to be reminded that she's not ordinary when somebody who's not of color says, oh, can I touch your hair? Like, these are microaggressions. And we don't know what we don't know, but it is our responsibility. And that is the individual, not the identity in which is being victimized, not to teach you. It's your responsibility. And everybody is too smart at this point to still allow that to be their excuse.
Well, we're quickly running out of time, so I'll put out a last call for questions if anybody would like to include them in the chat box. But just to wrap up on this particular topic, MICHAELLE, following on your advice, do you have any specific resources or anything that you could provide our audience tonight as far as a go-to on how to be an advocate for someone who's the target of hate speech and to actually do some good when they find themselves in a situation where someone is being attacked verbally?
Yeah, I want to practice what I preach in this sense. So if I were to give you the book title, then I'm not letting you do the work for yourself. So I would say, go ahead and experiment, try things, Google, like think about different ally groups. I promise you, if you just put in the word anti-racist, you will have a lot of your questions already answered for you. And then from there, you can reach out to your allies within these different groups to get affirmed or get their feedback. But you have to show them you mean this growth by starting with you. And lucky for us, this is hosted by our library. So go to the library and ask our librarian. My first job was in the Mount Pleasant Library, and I will always be grateful to Donna Whiting for trusting a 14-year-old to shelve her books. And we have just so many resources at our disposal, like no contact pickup. We got this. Do the work.
So start Googling and find yourself a librarian. I like it. Any Ilana, any suggestions for you before I get to last comments from anyone? Do you have any specific guidance or suggestions you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's perfect. Do some research. And the other thing, you know, Google, use the library, and Rhode Island is notorious for being full of nonprofit organizations. And there are a lot of nonprofits that do this kind of work so if you can identify that, like YPI has a pretty long resource list on our website, not necessarily around hate speech, but around LGBT issues, you know, so find some of these organizations that are doing the work, whose job it is to tell you about it. And we will, but don't go find your one, you know, neighbor and say, hey, can you hand me everything I should know, right?
Yes. Youth in Action also has lots of trainings and supports. We are focused on all as social justice issues and youth leading that charge. You want a 17-year-old to come and run a workshop for your leadership team? Done and done. Like, there's so many powerful people in Providence. That's the beauty of Providence with our nonprofit world.
So MICHAELLE, as we wrap up here, do you have any final words? And if not, can you provide your contact information? How do those attending the event tonight get in touch with you if they'd like to learn more about you and your organization?
Yeah, I'm more than happy to put my email and phone number. I think the audience I'd love to target right now are parents who are really feeling uneasy and need support with navigating and supporting their children, especially if you do not feel comfortable within the language or within the educational system right now. It is very hard, and the feelings you feel are valid. My other plug would be for people who have young adult children or teenage children who need a place in allyship, like yes, Youth Pride, yes, Youth in Action. There's just so many places. And so if you want a place for your child to feel safe and continue to develop who they are, like we'd love to be resources in that way for you. But I'm really just grateful for this space, and I hope people continue this conversation. Like, I wonder, will you play this recording for your family at Christmas time and really start a dialogue, right? That's how we kind of continue this this really important conversation. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Stephen, any final words? And maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the Rhode Island chapter of the ACLU and the resources you provide and how you can be contacted.
Sure. I'll end with saying something that may seem very far afield of what we talked about, but I think it's really complementary, and it gets to the question of, you know, who's at the table, you know, why aren't certain people at the table? You know, I think we have to look, in addition to these individual conversations, we need to look at the structural problems, you know, why there is this racism. The one issue in particular that focuses on who's at the table is voting rights. There are certain people who aren't at the table because laws prevent people from being represented as they should be. And, you know, if people are interested in, you know, in looking at the issue from, you know, from the 30,000 foot level, from a macro level, look at the barriers that are in place that really do harm people of color in being represented as they should be. I think addressing that issue would also go a long way towards dealing with this broader, this subset of hate speech and the impact that it has on individuals. In terms of contacting us, we encourage people to check our website. It's riaclu.org. We have lots of information on there about our court cases, about legislative action we're taking, and if people feel that their civil rights have been violated, there's contact information on our website for people to use.
Thank you, Stephen. Gregory, final words, and how can we contact you?
Justin, you know that anyone can contact me through going to NEFAC.org. The work that NEFAC has done over the years and is doing here tonight is just so exciting and promising to me. And either Justin or I and others at the NEFAC board are perfectly willing to show up at your school, your Rotary Club, your anywhere. Justin knows that I love to talk about the First Amendment, whether I'm talking to one person or 300, as I sometimes do. So I can be contacted through Justin at nefac.org. And we love spreading the word about the First Amendment. And I want to thank all you panelists. When I say I'm very hopeful for the future and you guys want some affirmation, just look in the mirror when you, I was gonna say when you go home, but you're probably at home. And you guys are doing a great job, and keep it up, and thank you.
Thank you, Greg. And finally, Ilana, last words, and how can we best reach you for follow-up conversations?
Well, here I will, there is my email and our website. And you know, the joke at YPI is that you can send an email to, I don't remember your name, at youthprideri.org, and it will eventually get to me. And so I will happily talk to anybody who works with youth, because the truth is, if you work with youth, you work with LGBT youth. And so we are happy to come and talk to you and offer support in whatever way, in whatever kind of community setting you're in. And any young folks between the ages of, actually starting in January, between the ages of 5 and 24 are welcome to access our services, no matter how they identify or who they are. So please reach out. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Ilana. And just a brief word about NEFAC. Again, New England First Amendment Coalition, we're here to provide educational resources to the general public, to teachers. We can provide you with any kind of speaker related to the First Amendment, whether it's an attorney, a journalist, an academic, to come into your classroom, whatever location you would like, or online, and have a conversation like this. We're here for your service. I would also like to make a pitch for anyone who would like to support NEFAC and join us for a conversation with CNN's John King. I'm sure many of you watched him on CNN before, during, and after the election, the master of the magic wall. We'll be having a program with him Monday night, and I would encourage everyone to attend. You can go to nefac.org to find more information about that. And lastly, a couple thank yous before we wrap up. Thank you again to all of you panelists for taking the time to be with us here tonight and to really help us wrestle with what I think are some very difficult issues. And along those lines, I want to thank everybody who attended. We had a great turnout tonight. For all of those who took time out of their evening to be a part of this conversation, to ask really important questions. You know, that's a really important thing that you're doing, and that more people need to do. We need more people as part of this dialogue, as part of this conversation, and really wrestling with these topics. So kudos to all of you. And lastly, as Joseph is now showing himself here on Zoom, thank you, Joseph, and all the work you do at the Providence Community Libraries. You know, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation tonight, and for your invitation to do so. So many thank yous.